The world we think we know is built upon layers of forgotten civilizations, buried ambitions, and choices made by people whose names have been swallowed by time. But every now and then, a place rises from the ancient past with such force that thousands of years cannot erase it from memory. Sparta is one of those places. It was not the richest city in Greece. It was not the most beautiful. It did not produce the grandest temples or the most celebrated philosophers. Yet somehow, across all the centuries that separate us from the ancient world, the name Sparta still carries a weight that makes people stop and listen. There is something magnetic about a society that deliberately chose hardship over comfort, silence over spectacle, and discipline over freedom. Sparta fascinates us because it dared to organize human life around principles that most civilizations would consider unbearable. To understand Sparta, you cannot simply memorize a list of facts and dates. You have to feel the texture of the world it existed in. You have to imagine yourself standing on Greek soil more than 2,500 years ago, surrounded by mountains and olive groves, listening to the sound of a river moving through a valley that would shape the destiny of an entire people. You have to understand what drove them, what terrified them, and what they were willing to sacrifice in order to survive. Because Sparta was not born out of arrogance or cruelty for its own sake. It was born out of fear, necessity, and a desperate determination to never be vulnerable again. Every law, every custom, every brutal training exercise that shocks us today grew from a soil fertilized by real danger and real consequence. Before we walk through the gates of this ancient city, it helps to understand the land itself. Geography is one of the most underestimated forces in history. The shape of a coastline, the height of a mountain range, the fertility of a valley. These things do not simply decorate the background of human events. They shape decisions, limit options, and create opportunities that ripple forward through generations. Sparta's story begins with the earth beneath its feet, and that earth was both a gift and a challenge. Sparta stood in the southeastern part of the Peloponnese, that great hand-shaped landmass that dangles from the body of mainland Greece like something reaching toward the sea. The city itself was positioned in the valley of the Eurotas River, a long, fertile corridor of land that ran roughly north to south, hemmed in on both sides by formidable mountain ranges. To the west rose the Taygetus Range, a dramatic spine of rock and snow that climbed to heights of nearly 8,000 feet. To the east lay the lower but still significant Parnon Range. Between these two walls of stone, the Eurotas wound its way through rich agricultural ground, watering orchards, fields, and pastures that would become the material foundation of everything Sparta built. This valley was not just land. It was a cradle. The mountains on either side created natural barriers that made invasion difficult and gave the inhabitants a sense of enclosure, of being set apart from the wider world. The Eurotas provided water for crops and livestock, while the surrounding hillsides offered grazing land, timber, and wild game. In a world where most Greek communities struggled to feed themselves from thin, rocky soil, the Eurotas Valley was remarkably generous. It gave Sparta something that many of its rivals lacked: enough productive land to support a significant population without depending entirely on trade or overseas grain. But the valley was more than a breadbasket. It was a psychological landscape. Growing up surrounded by those towering mountains, a young Spartan would have absorbed a sense of living in a protected but demanding world. The peaks of Taygetus, capped with snow in winter and blazing with heat in summer, served as a constant reminder that nature was not gentle. The land could provide, but it required work, strength, and endurance to harvest its rewards. The river could nourish, but floods and drought could punish. Every element of the landscape seemed to whisper the same lesson that Spartan society would later shout: survival belongs to those who are prepared. Mount Taygetus itself became woven into the mythology and daily reality of Spartan life. Its slopes held paths that connected Laconia to the western territory of Messenia, the conquered heartland whose labor would eventually make the Spartan way of life possible. Its heights offered vantage points from which watchers could scan the horizon for approaching threats. Its forests sheltered wildlife that provided opportunities for hunting, an activity the Spartans valued not merely as sport, but as training for the skills of war: patience, tracking, stealth, and the ability to endure physical hardship in rough terrain. The mountain was not just a backdrop. It was a participant in the story, shaping the character of the people who lived in its shadow. Now, imagine standing in this valley around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, long before Sparta became the fearsome military power that later generations would remember. At this point, Sparta was still finding its identity. It was a collection of villages that had gradually merged into something resembling a city, though it never developed the dense urban core that characterized places like Athens or Corinth. Even in its prime, Sparta would remain more like a cluster of communities spread across the valley floor than a single concentrated metropolis. This physical layout reflected something deeper about Spartan values. The city did not need towering walls or gleaming public buildings to announce its importance. Its power would come from something far more difficult to build than stone: the disciplined human beings who lived within its borders. The early history of Sparta is shrouded in the kind of half-light that covers most of archaic Greece. We catch glimpses through later writers, through fragments of poetry, through archaeological remains that hint at a world more complex and culturally rich than the austere legend would suggest. In its earlier centuries, Sparta was not yet the grim military machine of popular imagination. It was a community that participated in the broader cultural life of Greece, producing poets and musicians whose work was admired far beyond Laconia. Festivals drew visitors. Craftsmen created objects of beauty. The city was connected to the wider Greek world through trade, religious networks, and the shared cultural traditions that linked Hellenic communities from Sicily to the coast of Asia Minor. But something changed. Something happened that pushed Sparta down a path so different from its neighbors that it would become almost unrecognizable to the rest of Greece. That something was conquest, and the fear that conquest inevitably brings. To the west of the Taygetus Mountains lay Messenia, a region blessed with some of the richest farmland in all of Greece. The Messenian plain was extraordinarily fertile, capable of producing abundant harvests of grain, olives, and other crops that were the lifeblood of ancient economies. For a growing power like Sparta, Messenia represented an irresistible prize. Control of that land would mean wealth, security, and the ability to support a larger population than the Eurotas Valley alone could sustain. The temptation was enormous, and Sparta did not resist it. The wars that followed were remembered as long, bitter, and brutal. Ancient tradition speaks of two major conflicts: the First and Second Messenian Wars, though the precise details are difficult to reconstruct with certainty. What is clear is that Sparta eventually succeeded in subjugating Messenia and reducing its population to a state of forced dependence. The Messenians did not become slaves in the way that word is sometimes understood in later history. They became something perhaps even more unsettling: a conquered people bound to the land, forced to work it for the benefit of Spartan masters, yet retaining enough collective identity and memory to dream of freedom. These people were called Helots, and their existence would shape every aspect of Spartan life for centuries to come. The conquest of Messenia was a turning point so profound that everything that came after can be understood as a consequence of that single, transformative act. Sparta had swallowed a territory roughly equal to its own, gaining access to agricultural wealth that dwarfed what most Greek cities could claim. But it had also swallowed a population that outnumbered its own citizens by a significant margin. Some ancient estimates suggest the ratio was as high as 7 or even 10 to 1. This created a permanent crisis at the heart of Spartan society. The very thing that made Sparta rich and powerful also made it terrified. Think about what that means in practical terms. You are a Spartan citizen. Your household depends on Helot labor to produce the food that sustains your family and allows you to participate in the public life of the city. Without that labor, you cannot afford the contributions to your dining group that maintain your status as a full citizen. Without that labor, you cannot spend your days in training, politics, and military readiness. The Helots are the invisible foundation upon which your entire world is built. And yet, those same Helots remember that this land was once theirs. They remember conquest, humiliation, and the loss of freedom. They outnumber you. They work your fields. They know the terrain. And they hate you. This is the fear that transformed Sparta. This is the anxiety that turned a Greek community with poets and musicians into the most militarized society the ancient world had ever seen. Every institution, every custom, Every brutal detail of Spartan life that makes modern readers uncomfortable can be traced back to this fundamental terror. The terror of a small ruling class sitting atop a vast, resentful population that could, at any moment, rise up and destroy everything. Sparta did not become harsh because its people were naturally cruel. It became harsh because it believed, with considerable justification, that softness meant death. The Helots farmed the estates that Spartan citizens depended upon. They planted grain, tended olive trees, harvested crops, and delivered a portion of their produce to the households they served. This arrangement freed the Spartan citizen class from the daily demands of agricultural labor, which in every other Greek city consumed most of a man's time and energy. In Athens, a citizen might spend his morning in the assembly debating policy and his afternoon tending his farm. In Corinth, a merchant might divide his attention between trade and civic duty. In Sparta, a full citizen was expected to devote himself entirely to the life of the state, training, communal dining, military service, and the maintenance of the social order that kept everything in place. This was an extraordinary luxury, but it came at an extraordinary cost. The Helot system created a society permanently on edge. Spartan authorities reportedly declared a ritual war on the Helots each year, which served both a religious and a psychological purpose. It reminded the Helots of their subordinate status, and it reminded the Spartans that vigilance could never be relaxed. The fear of Helot revolt was not theoretical. It was a living, breathing anxiety that influenced every major decision the Spartan state ever made. When Sparta considered sending its army far from home, it had to weigh the risk of leaving the Helot population unsupervised. When Sparta thought about expanding its influence overseas, it had to consider whether spreading its already thin citizen body even thinner might invite disaster at home. When Sparta designed its educational system, its dining customs, its marriage practices, and its military training, every element was shaped by the need to produce citizens who could maintain control over a population that vastly outnumbered them. The Helots were not just workers. They were the reason Sparta became Sparta. And this brings us to the most famous and most controversial aspect of Spartan civilization, the system of training that turned Spartan boys into the warriors the ancient world both admired and feared. This system was called the agoge, and it was unlike anything else in Greece. In most Greek cities, the education of children was primarily the responsibility of the family. A father might hire a tutor, send his son to a teacher of music or gymnastics, or simply pass along the skills of his trade through daily example. Education was private, personal, and varied enormously depending on wealth and social status. In Sparta, education was none of these things. It was public, uniform, and controlled by the state with an intensity that still has the power to astonish. A Spartan boy's journey through the agoge began at the age of 7. Try to imagine what that means. A child of 7 is still small, still dependent, still learning the basic rhythms of the world. In most societies, a 7-year-old is surrounded by the warmth and protection of family life. In Sparta, a 7-year-old was taken from his home and placed into a system designed by the city to reshape him from the ground up. He did not belong to his parents anymore, at least not in the way that other Greek children belonged to theirs. He belonged to Sparta. The boys were organized into groups, and within those groups, hierarchy and discipline governed every waking moment. They lived together, ate together, trained together, and were supervised by older youths and adults who had the authority to correct, punish, and test them at will. The accommodations were deliberately Spartan in every sense of the word. Bedding was rough. Clothing was minimal. Tradition says each boy received a single cloak per year, regardless of the season. Food was intentionally limited, not enough to satisfy hunger, but enough to survive. The message was clear from the very first day. Comfort is your enemy. Hunger is your teacher. Cold is your companion. Learn to endure, or learn that you are not worthy of the name you carry. The training was physical, mental, and social all at once. Boys ran, wrestled, fought, and competed in exercises designed to build strength, speed, and the ability to absorb pain without complaint. But the agoge was not simply a gymnasium. It was an education in character. Boys were expected to learn reading, music, and the art of speaking with the kind of sharp, controlled brevity that would later make Spartan sayings famous across the Greek world. They memorized poetry. They sang in choruses. They danced in formations that trained the body to move in coordination with others, a skill that would prove essential when those same bodies stood shoulder to shoulder in the battle line. Music might seem like a strange subject for a military education, but the Spartans understood something profound about the relationship between rhythm and discipline. A chorus that moves together learns timing. A group that sings together learns to subordinate individual impulse to collective harmony. These are exactly the qualities that make a phalanx effective. The boy who could hold his place in a dance was being prepared, without necessarily knowing it, to hold his place in a formation where breaking rhythm could mean death. Sparta did not separate art from war. It made art serve war, and in doing so, it created a culture where even beauty carried the weight of purpose. But the most famous aspect of the agoge was its deliberate cultivation of hardship. The boys were not merely expected to tolerate discomfort. They were expected to seek it out, master it, and prove that they could function effectively no matter how much their bodies suffered. Food was kept scarce, and tradition tells us that boys were actually encouraged to steal extra provisions, but with a cruel twist. The crime was not the stealing itself. The crime was getting caught. A boy who successfully pilfered food from a storehouse or a neighboring farm demonstrated the cunning, stealth, and nerve that a soldier might need behind enemy lines. A boy who was caught demonstrated only clumsiness, and clumsiness was punished severely. This practice sounds almost absurd to modern ears, but it reveals something important about how Sparta thought about moral education. The city was not teaching boys that theft was acceptable in ordinary life. It was teaching them that resourcefulness under pressure was more valuable than passive obedience to comfortable rules. A soldier who could survive on his wits, find food in hostile territory, and move unseen through dangerous ground was more useful than one who could only function when everything was provided for him. The agoge was designed to produce men who could improvise, adapt, and endure, men who would not fall apart when the orderly world they knew was stripped away. The famous story of the Spartan boy and the fox captures this philosophy with devastating clarity. According to the tale, a boy had stolen a fox and hidden it beneath his cloak. When adults approached, the boy stood still and said nothing, even as the fox tore at his body with its teeth and claws. He died rather than reveal his theft. The story may be legend rather than documented fact, but its survival tells us everything about what Sparta valued. The boy chose death over the shame of being caught. He chose silence over the weakness of crying out. He chose loyalty to the code over loyalty to his own survival. Whether or not this particular event happened exactly as described, the fact that Spartans told this story to their children tells us what kind of adults they were trying to create. Hunger was one of the agoge's most powerful tools, not because Sparta was too poor to feed its children, but because Sparta deliberately chose to make its children hungry. A full stomach makes the body comfortable, and comfort was precisely what the agoge was designed to destroy. A hungry child is alert, watchful, and constantly aware of his surroundings. He notices where food is stored. He learns which adults are paying attention and which are distracted. He develops the habit of observation that a scout or a sentry would need in the field. He also learns, day after day, that his body can function through discomfort, that the growling of his stomach is not a signal to stop, but a reminder that endurance has no natural limit except the one he accepts. This philosophy extended far beyond food. Boys were expected to sleep on rough bedding, often made from reeds they gathered themselves from the banks of the Eurotas River. They were expected to go barefoot in all weather, toughening their feet against the stones and thorns of the Laconian landscape. They were expected to endure cold without heavy clothing, heat without shade, and exhaustion without complaint. Every element of daily life was arranged to teach one overarching lesson. The body is a tool, and a tool must be hardened before it can be trusted. Older youths played a critical role in the system. The agoge was not simply a relationship between adult instructors and young students. It was a layered hierarchy in which boys of different ages interacted, competed, and shaped one another. Older youths served as models, mentors, and sometimes enforcers. They were expected to guide younger boys, but also to test them, challenge them, and hold them accountable for their behavior. This created a web of relationships that extended beyond any single adult's supervision. A boy was watched not only by his teachers, but by his peers and seniors, creating a constant pressure to perform, conform, and demonstrate the qualities the city valued. The bonds formed during these years were not incidental. They were deliberate. Sparta understood that men who had suffered together, competed together, and endured the same hardships would fight for one another with a ferocity that no amount of tactical instruction could produce. The agoge was not just training soldiers. It was building the emotional architecture of a unit that would one day stand in the phalanx, where each man's courage was the shield that protected his neighbor. The friendships forged in the dust and cold of youth would become the mortar that held the battle line together when fear tried to tear it apart. A boy who completed the agoge did not simply graduate into ordinary adulthood. He entered a world of continued obligation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The transition from youth to full citizenship was not a single moment, but a series of passages, each one confirming that the individual had earned his place in the community of equals. The word Sparta used for its full citizens tells us everything about the ideal. They called themselves homoioi, which translates roughly as equals, or those who are alike. The name declared that citizenship was not merely a legal status. It was a shared identity forged through common experience, common suffering, and common commitment to the state. But here is where the story becomes more complicated and more honest. The equality that Sparta celebrated among its citizens was real in certain important ways. Every full citizen had passed through the same training. Every full citizen ate at the same communal tables. Every full citizen served in the same army and was expected to meet the same standards of conduct. In a world where most societies were openly divided by wealth, birth, and privilege, this insistence on shared experience was genuinely remarkable. Other Greeks noticed it, admired it, and sometimes envied it. Yet this equality existed inside a very narrow circle. Outside that circle, the world looked entirely different. The Helots who worked the land had no share in Spartan equality. The Perioikoi, the free but non-citizen communities scattered across Laconia and Messenia, participated in Spartan military campaigns and economic life, but had no voice in Spartan politics. Women, despite their unusual freedoms, held no formal political power. And even among the citizens themselves, wealth was not perfectly distributed, despite the ideology of sameness. Some families controlled more land, more influence, and more social capital than others. The equality of the homoioi was genuine within its boundaries, but those boundaries excluded the vast majority of people who lived under Spartan authority. This is one of the most important things to understand about Sparta, because it saves us from the trap of either blind admiration or simple condemnation. Sparta was a society that took certain ideals, discipline, courage, loyalty, endurance, collective identity, and pursued them with an intensity that no other Greek city could match. Within the circle of full citizenship, it created something genuinely extraordinary. But it built that extraordinary achievement on a foundation of conquest, coercion, and exclusion that cannot be separated from the finished product. The warrior who stood calmly in the battle line, his long hair combed, his red cloak draped over his shoulders, his shield steady on his arm, was a magnificent human creation. But he stood there because someone else was plowing his fields, someone else was harvesting his grain, and someone else was living in fear so that he could live in discipline. Now, one of the most unusual features of the Spartan state was its system of government, which combined elements that most political theorists would consider incompatible. Sparta had kings, not one, but two, ruling simultaneously. This dual kingship was one of the most distinctive institutions in all of ancient Greece, and its origins reach back into the misty borderland where history and mythology blend together. Both royal houses claimed descent from Heracles, the greatest hero of Greek myth. This was not merely a decorative genealogy. In the ancient world, heroic ancestry carried real political weight. A king who could trace his bloodline back to a figure like Heracles was claiming a connection to divine favor, to ancient destiny, and to the very foundations of the Greek heroic tradition. Heracles was associated with strength, endurance, and the completion of impossible tasks, qualities that aligned perfectly with the image Sparta wished to project. The kings were therefore not simply political leaders. They were sacred figures, living links between the city and its mythic past, between the human world and the realm of gods and heroes. The two royal families were the Agiads and the Eurypontids, and each maintained its own line of succession. This meant that at any given time, Sparta had two kings drawn from two different families, each with its own traditions, rivalries, and ambitions. To modernize, this arrangement seems like a recipe for chaos. How can a state function with two rulers who might disagree on every important question? Yet Sparta made it work, at least most of the time, by building the dual kingship into a system of checks and balances that prevented any single individual from accumulating too much power. The practical advantages were significant. One king could lead an army on campaign while the other remained at home, ensuring that royal authority was never entirely absent from the city. If one royal line suffered a crisis, the death of a king without a clear heir, a scandal that undermined public confidence, the other line could provide stability. The two kings watched each other, competed with each other, and served as natural limits on each other's ambitions. This competitive tension was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Sparta had learned, perhaps through bitter experience, that concentrated power was dangerous, and it built institutional safeguards against it at the very highest level of government. But the kings did not rule alone. Their authority was constrained by other institutions that gave Spartan government its famous complexity. The most important of these was the Gerousia, a council of elders that wielded extraordinary influence over the city's affairs. Membership in the Gerousia was restricted to men over the age of 60, an age at which Spartan men were released from regular military obligation and could devote themselves entirely to public life. The council had 28 members, elected for life, plus the two kings, who sat with the elders as ex officio members. Together, they prepared legislation for the assembly, heard important legal cases, and helped shape the direction of state policy. The requirement that members be at least 60 years old reveals something important about Spartan values. In a society obsessed with physical strength and military prowess, it might seem strange that the highest council was reserved for men who had passed beyond the age of active service. But Sparta understood that wisdom was not the same thing as strength, and that a man who had survived decades of service to the state, who had endured the agoge, fought in battles, raised sons, contributed to his dining group, and navigated the complex social pressures of Spartan life, possessed a kind of tested judgment that younger men could not yet claim. The elders had proven themselves over a lifetime. Their authority was earned through endurance, not merely granted by birth or wealth. Yet the lifetime tenure of the Gerousia also meant that conservative voices held enormous weight in Spartan politics. These were men whose formative experiences belonged to an earlier generation. They had been shaped by the customs and assumptions of their youth, and they naturally tended to favor continuity over innovation. Change, in any form, had to pass through a council whose members had spent their entire lives within the existing system. This made Sparta extraordinarily resistant to reform, even when reform might have been necessary. The institution that provided stability also provided rigidity, and over the long course of Spartan history, that rigidity would prove increasingly costly. Alongside the kings and the Gerousia stood the ephors, 5 officials elected annually by the citizen body. The ephorate was one of the most powerful magistracies in Sparta, and its existence reveals just how complex Spartan government really was beneath its surface simplicity. The ephors supervised aspects of public life that touched every citizen. They handled elements of foreign policy, oversaw the conduct of magistrates and officials, and, most remarkably, watched the kings themselves with an authority that could be startling. Tradition says that the ephors and the kings exchanged oaths regularly, a ritual that symbolized the ongoing negotiation between royal authority and civic accountability. The ephors could bring charges against a king. They could put a king on trial. They could, in extreme cases, challenge royal decisions that they believed threatened the welfare of the state. This created a political tension at the very heart of Spartan government, a tension between the sacred prestige of hereditary kingship and the annually renewed authority of elected magistrates who represented the broader citizen body. This tension was not a weakness. It was a design feature. Sparta had built a system in which power was divided, watched, and constrained at every level. Kings checked each other. The Gerousia checked the kings. The ephors checked the Gerousia. And the assembly of citizens, the body of all full Spartan men, provided a final layer of collective authority that, however limited in practice, reminded everyone that the state belonged to its people, not to any single ruler or faction. The assembly itself operated in a way that strikes modern observers as both fascinating and crude. Citizens gathered to hear proposals and to indicate their approval or rejection, but they did not vote by individual ballot in the way that a modern parliament would. Instead, ancient accounts describe a system in which the outcome was determined by the volume of shouting. Officials would listen to the assembled citizens voice their support or opposition and would judge which side sounded louder. To us, this method seems wildly imprecise, almost theatrical. How could anyone accurately measure the volume of competing shouts? How could such a system prevent manipulation or error? Yet the method made a kind of sense within Spartan culture. The assembly was not a forum for extended debate. It was a place where the citizen body expressed collective will through collective sound. The shout was not a private act hidden in a ballot box. It was a public declaration made with the whole body, heard by everyone present. It required courage, because your neighbors could hear whether you raised your voice or stayed silent. It required commitment, because the volume of your response reflected the strength of your conviction. In a society that valued physical presence, public reputation, and collective action, the shout was not a primitive substitute for a better system. It was an expression of the same values that governed every other aspect of Spartan life: visibility, participation, and the willingness to stand and be counted. The Spartan constitution impressed ancient observers because it seemed to combine the best features of different forms of government while avoiding the worst. It had monarchy without tyranny. It had aristocratic council without oligarchic excess. It had popular participation without democratic chaos. Philosophers and political thinkers pointed to Sparta as evidence that a mixed constitution could produce unusual stability. The city seemed to have found a balance that other communities struggled to achieve, a balance between authority and accountability, between tradition and adaptation, between the power of the few and the voice of the many. Of course, this admiration came with important caveats. Most people under Spartan control had no voice in this carefully balanced system. The helots, the perioikoi, and women of all classes were excluded from the political process that ancient thinkers praised so highly. The stability that observers admired was stability for the ruling group, maintained at the expense of everyone else. But even with those qualifications, the Spartan constitution remains historically significant because it showed the ancient world what deliberate institutional design could achieve. Sparta did not simply inherit its government from some distant ancestor. It built it piece by piece, creating a machine of governance that was admired, imitated, and debated for centuries. And this brings us to one of the most mysterious and contested figures in all of ancient history, the lawgiver Lycurgus, the man tradition credited with creating the Spartan way of life. According to ancient accounts, Lycurgus was the great reformer who gave Sparta its constitution, its agoge, its communal dining system, and the entire framework of laws and customs that made the city unique. He was presented as a figure of almost superhuman wisdom, a man who traveled widely, studied the institutions of other societies, and then returned to Sparta with a vision so complete and so compelling that the city adopted it wholesale and never looked back. The problem is that historians cannot determine with any certainty whether Lycurgus was a real person, a mythologized memory of multiple reformers, or a complete invention designed to give Sparta's institutions the authority of a single founding genius. Different ancient writers placed him in different time periods. The stories told about him often feel more symbolic than biographical. He may have been a real leader whose memory grew larger with each retelling, accumulating details and achievements that originally belonged to different people in different eras. Or he may have been a narrative device, a single name attached to a complex historical process because societies find it easier to explain themselves through great individuals than through gradual, messy evolution. What matters is not whether Lycurgus was real in the biographical sense, but what his legend tells us about how Sparta understood itself. By attributing its entire way of life to a single lawgiver, Sparta could present its customs as deliberate, ancient, and sacred. The system was not an accident of history. It was a conscious creation, designed by a wise man and preserved by a disciplined people. This narrative gave the Spartan order a kind of religious authority. To question the system was not merely to propose a political reform. It was to challenge the wisdom of the founder, the tradition of the ancestors, and the will of the gods who had sanctioned the original design. This is why Sparta resisted change with such ferocity. The legend of Lycurgus turned the status quo into a sacred inheritance. Every custom, every institution, every uncomfortable detail of Spartan life was protected by the belief that it had been ordained by a figure whose wisdom surpassed ordinary human understanding. Reform was not just risky, it was impious. And in a society where religion and politics were inseparably intertwined, impiety was the most dangerous accusation anyone could face. The world that Lycurgus supposedly created, or that Sparta created and attributed to Lycurgus, was a world in which every detail of daily life served the needs of the state. Nothing was private in the way that we understand privacy today. The citizen did not belong to himself. He belonged to the community, and the community shaped him from the moment of his birth to the moment of his death. This total integration of individual and state is what makes Sparta so compelling and so disturbing. It produced remarkable results: courage, discipline, cohesion, and a reputation that terrified enemies for generations. But it achieved those results by demanding something that most human beings find unbearable: the surrender of personal autonomy to collective purpose. The tension between individual freedom and communal obligation is one of the oldest problems in human civilization. Every society, in every era, must find some way to balance the desires of the person against the needs of the group. Most societies find a compromise, allowing individuals enough freedom to pursue their own happiness while requiring enough conformity to maintain social order. Sparta rejected compromise. It pushed the dial as far toward collective obligation as any society in recorded history, and it held it there for centuries. The results were extraordinary, but the cost was equally extraordinary, and that cost would eventually contribute to the system's undoing. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we examine how Sparta declined, we need to understand how it lived at its peak, how its citizens spent their days, how its women defied the expectations of the Greek world, how its warriors fought and died, and how the legend of Spartan invincibility was built, tested, and ultimately shattered. There is so much more to explore in this ancient city, so many details that bring its world to life, so many stories that reveal the humanity beneath the armor. The communal dining system was one of the pillars of Spartan social life, and it deserves careful attention because it reveals how thoroughly the state controlled even the most basic human activities. In most Greek cities, a man ate dinner with his family, in his own home, with whatever food his household could provide. The meal was a private occasion, shaped by personal taste, family tradition, and economic circumstance. In Sparta, eating was a public act, governed by rules that turned the dinner table into another instrument of civic discipline. Every full Spartan citizen was required to belong to a dining group called a syssitia. These groups typically consisted of about 15 men who ate together regularly, sharing meals that were deliberately simple and designed to reinforce the values of equality, self-control, and mutual accountability. Each member was required to contribute a fixed amount of food and supplies from his own household: barley, wine, cheese, figs, and sometimes meat, and these contributions were pooled to feed the group. The meal was not a feast. It was fuel, provided in quantities sufficient for health and strength, but insufficient for luxury or indulgence. The most infamous dish served at these communal tables was the black broth, a dark stew made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt that became legendary across the Greek world, not for its taste, but for its awfulness. Visitors from other cities who sampled the broth were reportedly horrified, and one famous anecdote claims that a foreign dignitary, after tasting the dish, declared that he finally understood why Spartans did not fear death. The joke was savage, but it captured something true about the Spartan relationship with food. In a society that treated pleasure as a potential threat to discipline, even dinner became an exercise in endurance. The black broth was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to sustain the body while reminding the spirit that comfort was not the purpose of existence. The dining groups served multiple functions beyond simple nourishment. They created bonds of loyalty and familiarity among men who would eventually stand together in the battle line. They reinforced the ideal of equality by making every citizen eat the same food in the same setting. They kept citizens connected to public life and prevented the dangerous accumulation of private leisure that might lead to softness, intrigue, or disloyalty. And they served as a mechanism of social control, because admission to a syssitia required the unanimous approval of its existing members. A single negative vote could exclude a man, which meant that membership depended not only on birth and training, but on the ongoing judgment of one's peers. This detail is crucial because it reveals how fragile Spartan equality could be beneath its proud surface. A man might complete the agoge, demonstrate courage in battle, and possess every quality that the city claimed to value, yet still find himself excluded from full participation in public life if his peers rejected him or if his economic circumstances prevented him from making his required contributions. Citizenship in Sparta was not a permanent guarantee. It was a demanding privilege that had to be earned and maintained through continuous effort, and a man who fell below the required standard, whether through poverty, social failure, or simple bad luck, could find himself sliding toward the margins of a society that had no patience for weakness. This is one of the great paradoxes of Sparta. The city preached equality among its citizens, yet it created a system in which equality depended on conditions that not every citizen could always meet. Over time, as land became concentrated in fewer hands and the costs of citizenship became harder for some families to bear, the number of full citizens began to shrink. This slow erosion of the citizen body would become one of the most serious threats Sparta ever faced, more dangerous, in the long run, than any foreign army. But before that decline began, Sparta stood at the peak of its power, and its citizens lived within a system that, for all its severity, produced results that the ancient world could not ignore. The Spartan warrior was not simply a well-trained soldier. He was the product of a society that had organized every aspect of human existence around the single goal of producing men who would not break under pressure. From the moment he was born, he was examined, tested, shaped, and judged by a community that demanded nothing less than total commitment. His childhood was a crucible. His meals were a ritual. His speech was a discipline. His body was a tool. His courage was not his own. It belonged to the city, and the city expected him to spend it without hesitation when the moment came. And when that moment came, the Spartan warrior entered the battlefield carrying not just his bronze shield, his iron-tipped spear, and his red cloak, but the weight of an entire civilization's expectations on his shoulders. He fought not for personal glory, though glory was not unwelcome, but for the men beside him, for the line that held or broke depending on his steadiness, and for the city that had made him what he was. He knew that his mother expected him to return with his shield or upon it. He knew that cowardice would bring not just personal disgrace, but social annihilation, a lifetime of shame, mockery, and isolation that would make death seem preferable. He knew that the men on either side of him were relying on his shield to protect their exposed flanks, just as he was relying on theirs. This mutual dependence was the secret of the Spartan phalanx, and it was the reason Spartan armies rarely broke in battle. Other Greek cities had brave soldiers, skilled fighters, and determined commanders. But Sparta had something more, a citizen body so thoroughly conditioned for collective action that panic, the great destroyer of ancient armies, found few places to take root. When a phalanx shattered, it usually shattered because one man ran, and his running opened a gap, and the gap spread fear, and fear spread flight, and within moments a disciplined line became a terrified mob. Sparta's entire social system was designed to prevent that cascade of failure. Every meal shared in the syssitia, every hardship endured in the agoge, every bond forged through years of common suffering, served to create men who would hold their ground even when every instinct screamed at them to flee. The shield itself was a physical embodiment of this philosophy. A hoplite's shield was large, round, and heavy, made of wood covered with bronze, and held on the left arm by a central armband and a grip at the rim. Its design meant that it protected the left side of the man who carried it, but it also extended outward to cover the right side of the man standing to his left in the formation. This was not an accident of engineering. It was a deliberate design that made protection a shared responsibility. Your shield kept you alive, but it also kept your neighbor alive. His shield did the same for the man to his left, and so on down the entire line. The phalanx was a chain of mutual dependence, and the shield was the link that held it together. This is why abandoning your shield carried such terrible shame in Spartan culture. A man who threw away his helmet or his breastplate had lost equipment that protected only himself. A man who threw away his shield had abandoned his duty to the man beside him. He had broken the chain. He had opened a gap through which death could enter the line. In Spartan eyes, this was not merely cowardice. It was betrayal, a violation of the fundamental social contract that bound every citizen to every other citizen in the shared enterprise of survival. The famous saying attributed to Spartan mothers, "Come back with your shield, or on it," captures this ethic with devastating economy. A warrior who returned carrying his shield had held his position and survived. A warrior who returned on his shield had died in his place, his body carried home by comrades who honored his sacrifice. Either outcome was acceptable. What was not acceptable was returning without the shield, because that could only mean one thing. You had dropped it in order to run faster, and in running, you had endangered everyone who trusted you to stand. Whether every Spartan mother actually spoke these words to every departing son is less important than the fact that the saying became part of the cultural vocabulary. It tells us that Spartan women were not expected to soften the demands of the state. They were expected to reinforce them, even in the most intimate and emotionally charged moments of family life. The doorway of the home became another threshold where the city's values were transmitted, where a young man was reminded that honor mattered more than survival, and where a mother proved her own courage by sending her son into danger without flinching. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of Spartan society, the position of women, which shocked and intrigued the rest of the Greek world in equal measure. In most Greek cities, respectable women lived under close domestic supervision. They managed households, raised children, and participated in religious ceremonies, but they were largely excluded from public life, physical activity, and independent economic action. Their world was the interior of the home, and their virtue was measured by how successfully they remained invisible to the outside world. Spartan women lived in a different universe. Girls received physical training that included running, wrestling, javelin throwing, and other athletic exercises that would have been considered scandalous in Athens or Corinth. They exercised in public settings, sometimes wearing clothing that other Greeks found shockingly minimal. They were encouraged to become strong, healthy, and confident, because Sparta believed that strong mothers would produce strong children, and strong children were the city's most valuable resource. This philosophy gave Spartan women a visibility and a physical presence that was unique in the Greek world. They moved through public spaces with a confidence that outsiders found either admirable or deeply unsettling, depending on their own cultural assumptions. Ancient writers from other cities commented on Spartan women with a mixture of fascination and anxiety. Some praised their strength and discipline. Others criticized them for being too bold, too independent, too willing to speak their minds in a world that expected female silence and submission. The physical training of girls was not an end in itself. It served the state's reproductive goals, which were understood as a matter of public policy rather than private choice. Sparta needed citizens, and citizens were born from the bodies of Spartan women. The city therefore had a direct interest in ensuring that those bodies were healthy, strong, and capable of producing children who could survive infancy and eventually complete the agoge. This was not feminism in any modern sense. It was instrumentalism, the treatment of women's bodies as resources to be optimized for the benefit of the state. But within that instrumentalist framework, Spartan women gained freedoms that women in other Greek cities could only dream about. Beyond physical training, Spartan women could own and manage property in ways that distinguished them sharply from their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. Because citizen men spent so much of their lives in military service, communal dining, and public obligations, women often bore primary responsibility for managing the household estate. This was not merely supervising servants or organizing domestic routines. It could involve managing agricultural production, overseeing the labor of helots, making economic decisions about land use and resource allocation, and ensuring that the household met its obligations to the state, including the contributions to the syssitia that maintained the husband's citizenship. Over time, the combination of inheritance patterns, dowry customs, and the steady attrition of male citizens through warfare created a situation in which a significant portion of Spartan land came under female control. By the classical period, some ancient observers claimed that women controlled as much as 2/5 of all Spartan property. Whether this figure is precisely accurate or somewhat exaggerated, the underlying reality was clear. Spartan women had become economically powerful in ways that challenged the assumptions of the wider Greek world. This economic power did not translate into formal political authority. Women could not vote in the assembly, serve on the Gerousia, or hold the office of Ephor. But property created influence that operated outside formal institutional channels. A woman who controlled a large estate was not merely a passive figure waiting for men to make decisions. She was a person whose resources sustained citizen households, whose marriages shaped alliances between powerful families, and whose economic judgment could determine whether a family maintained its status or slid into the dangerous margins where citizenship itself might be lost. Some Spartan women became among the richest individuals in all of Greece, a fact that ancient critics found deeply troubling. A society that preached austerity and collective discipline had produced women of extraordinary personal wealth, and that wealth gave them a kind of power that the system's designers had probably never intended. The philosopher Aristotle, writing from outside Sparta, criticized the city for allowing women too much influence, arguing that female control of property had contributed to Sparta's decline. Whether his analysis was fair or not, his comments reveal how visible and how controversial Spartan women's economic power had become. The boldness of Spartan women extended to their speech, which was as sharp and memorable as anything the men produced. Ancient collections of Spartan sayings include numerous remarks attributed to women, mothers, wives, and unnamed females whose words cut with a precision that rivaled the finest laconic wit. These sayings reinforced the values of the state with a directness that could be breathtaking. A mother who learned that her son had died in battle might respond not with grief, but with pride, declaring that she had borne him for exactly this purpose. A wife who saw her husband preparing for war might remind him that his duty was clear and that she expected him to fulfill it without hesitation. Whether these sayings were spoken exactly as preserved or polished by later storytellers, they reveal a cultural expectation that Spartan women would be as tough, as disciplined, and as committed to the state's values as the men who fought in its armies. The family was not a refuge from Sparta's demands. It was another arena in which those demands were transmitted, reinforced, and internalized. A boy who grew up hearing his mother speak with such fierce clarity would enter the agoge already understanding what was expected of him. The family doorway was not a boundary between the private and the public. It was a permeable membrane through which the state's values flowed in both directions. Marriage in Sparta was surrounded by customs that seemed bizarre to other Greeks. Ancient accounts describe a wedding ritual in which the bride had her hair cut short and was dressed in male clothing before being left in a darkened room to await her husband's visit. The husband came secretly, spent a brief time with his bride, and then returned to his male quarters, his barracks, or his dining group, as if nothing had happened. These early visits were conducted in secrecy, and tradition suggests that a young husband might father children before he and his wife had ever seen each other in daylight. These customs are strange enough to invite speculation about their meaning, and scholars have debated them extensively. The cutting of the bride's hair may have symbolized a transition from one status to another, marking the passage from girlhood to womanhood through a ritual alteration of appearance. The male clothing may have eased the transition by making the bride temporarily ambiguous, neither fully the person she had been nor fully the person she was becoming. The secrecy of the early visits may have served to maintain the husband's connection to his male community while gradually establishing the new marital bond. What is clear is that Sparta did not treat marriage as a purely private arrangement between two individuals. It was a civic institution, regulated by expectations that reflected the state's interests in reproduction, property, and social order. The city needed children, and it organized intimate life to serve that need. Personal romance was not the point. Duty was the point, and duty in Sparta governed everything from the battlefield to the bedroom. Perhaps the most disturbing tradition associated with Spartan family life concerns the treatment of newborns. Ancient writers tell us that when a baby was born, it was examined by elders of the community who assessed its physical fitness. A child judged to be strong and healthy was allowed to live and would eventually enter the agoge. A child judged to be weak or deformed was, according to the most extreme versions of the tradition, exposed, left to die in a wild place near Mount Taygetus called the Apothetai. Modern historians debate how literally this tradition should be taken. Infant exposure was practiced to some degree across the ancient Greek world, and it is possible that the Spartan version was exaggerated by later writers who wanted to emphasize the city's harshness. Archaeological evidence has not conclusively confirmed the existence of a specific exposure site, and some scholars believe the practice may have been less systematic and less universal than the literary tradition suggests. But even if the reality was more complicated than the legend, the tradition itself tells us something important about Spartan values. The city imagined itself as having a claim over human life from the very beginning. A child was not simply a private blessing to be cherished regardless of its condition. It was a potential citizen, a future soldier, a member of the community whose fitness was a matter of public concern. The state's interest in the quality of its future members began at birth and never relented. From the cradle to the grave, a Spartan existed not for himself, but for the city that shaped him, trained him, fed him, and ultimately consumed him. This is the world we are exploring, a world of extraordinary discipline and extraordinary cost, where courage and cruelty grew from the same soil, where freedom and subjugation existed side by side, and where the pursuit of collective excellence came at a price that most human beings would find unbearable. Sparta was not a simple place. It was not a cartoon of military virtue or a cautionary tale of authoritarian excess. It was a real community, inhabited by real people who loved their children, feared their enemies, honored their gods, and struggled with the same fundamental questions that every human society must face. Questions about power, justice, belonging, and the terrible price of security in a dangerous world. The gods played a far more important role in Spartan life than the military legend usually acknowledges. Religion was not a separate department of existence, neatly contained within temples and festival days. It permeated every aspect of Spartan society, from the education of children to the conduct of war, from the timing of campaigns to the interpretation of victory and defeat. The Spartans were deeply pious people who believed that their success depended not only on human discipline, but on divine favor, and they organized their public life accordingly. Before an army could march, sacrifices had to be performed and omens had to be read. A favorable sign meant that the gods approved of the campaign and that the city could proceed with confidence. An unfavorable sign could halt military operations regardless of strategic necessity. This was not superstition in the dismissive modern sense. It was a sincere belief that the universe operated according to divine will, and that human beings who ignored that will were courting disaster. A commander who marched against unfavorable omens was not simply being bold. He was being impious, and impiety could bring destruction upon the entire army. This religious sensibility created real tensions during moments of crisis. The most famous example involves the Carnea, a major festival of Apollo that imposed restrictions on military activity during its celebration. When the Persian invasion of Greece created an urgent need for Spartan action, the religious calendar conflicted with strategic necessity. The Spartans could not simply ignore the festival without violating obligations that they believed were sacred. This tension between piety and practicality was not unique to Sparta. It appeared throughout the Greek world, but it was especially visible in a society that took both military duty and religious obligation with deadly seriousness. Oracles and prophecies also played a significant role in Spartan decision-making. Sacred sites like Delphi, where the god Apollo spoke through his priestess, were consulted on matters of state policy, military strategy, and internal reform. The responses were often ambiguous, requiring interpretation by political leaders who might shape the meaning to suit their own purposes. But the consultation itself was genuine, reflecting a world in which human beings did not imagine themselves as fully autonomous agents. They lived within a web of divine attention, and their choices had to account for forces beyond human understanding. Even the kings, with all their military authority and sacred ancestry, could be restrained by religious considerations. A king who ignored unfavorable omens risked not only divine punishment, but political consequences at home. The Ephors and the Gerousia could use religious arguments to challenge royal decisions, and a king who seemed to act without proper regard for the gods might find his authority undermined. In Sparta, even the most powerful human being was subordinate to the divine order, and that subordination was enforced through institutions as well as belief. The sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, located near the Eurotas River, was one of the most important religious sites in Sparta, and the rituals performed there illustrate the deep connection between religion, training, and public identity. The goddess Artemis was associated with youth, the wilderness, and the dangerous transitions of growing up, and her sanctuary became a place where Spartan boys underwent rituals that tested their endurance in ways that combined physical pain with religious meaning. The most famous of these rituals involved a competition in which boys were whipped at the altar of the goddess, enduring pain before an audience of fellow citizens. The meaning of this practice likely changed over time, but at its core, it represented the idea that the passage from childhood to adulthood required suffering, and that suffering was not merely endured but offered to the divine. A boy who withstood the whipping without crying out demonstrated not only physical toughness but spiritual worthiness. He proved that he could meet the demands of the gods as well as the demands of the city. In later centuries, under Roman rule, this ritual became something different. A public spectacle that attracted tourists and curiosity seekers who came to watch what they believed were authentic ancient customs performed by the descendants of the famous warriors. The Spartans, whose political power had long since faded, found a new kind of influence as performers of their own heritage. The whipping ritual, once a sacred initiation, became a show, and Sparta itself became a living museum of discipline where visitors could glimpse the shadow of a vanished greatness. This transformation tells us something poignant about how cultures survive their own decline. When political power disappears, cultural identity can persist through memory, ritual, and performance. The Spartans of the Roman period were not the warriors of Thermopylae, but they carried the name, they maintained the customs, and they offered the world a version of Spartan identity that was part tradition, part theater, and part desperate preservation of a past that could never fully return. The stones of the sanctuary endured. The goddess still watched, but the world around them had changed beyond recognition, and the boys who endured the whipping did so not to prepare for a phalanx that would face Persian armies, but to maintain a legend that had become Sparta's most valuable surviving possession. Spartan festivals were not merely religious observances. They were civic performances that allowed the city to see itself reflected in controlled, beautiful, disciplined form. The Gymnopaedia, one of the most important Spartan festivals, featured choruses of young men performing dances that displayed physical training, musical skill, and the kind of precise coordination that the city valued above all else. The name suggests that participants performed naked or lightly clothed, in keeping with the Greek association between athletic nudity and public honor. But the Gymnopaedia was not simply an athletic event. It was a social ritual that connected generations, honored the dead, and renewed the community's commitment to the values that defined its identity. Dance in Sparta was never mere entertainment. It was training, worship, and communication all woven together. A chorus that moved in perfect unison demonstrated the same qualities that a phalanx required: timing, awareness of others, subordination of individual impulse to collective rhythm, and the ability to maintain order under the pressure of public observation. The audience watched not just for aesthetic pleasure, but for evidence of the qualities they valued most. A boy who danced well was showing that he could follow, that he could listen, and that he could place himself within a structure larger than his own desires. These were the same qualities that would be tested, years later, on the battlefield. The poet Tertius gave this military ideal its most powerful literary expression. His verses, composed in the archaic period, urged Spartan warriors to stand firm in the line, to fight for the honor of the city, and to treat courage as a civic obligation rather than a personal adventure. Poetry in Sparta was not decoration. It was instruction. A song performed at a festival or around a campfire could enter memory more deeply than any spoken command, settling into the rhythms of the body and the patterns of the mind. Tertius gave Sparta a soundtrack for its values, and his words helped transform the abstract ideal of duty into something that could be felt, remembered, and carried into battle. His poetry made courage sound like belonging. The individual body mattered because it occupied a place in the line, and the line mattered because it protected the community. The fear of death was answered not by promises of immortality, but by the promise that a man who died well would be honored by his people for generations. In Tertius, the warrior was not a solitary hero performing extraordinary feats. He was a citizen fulfilling the ordinary, essential, terrifying obligation of standing his ground when every instinct told him to run. That vision of courage, quiet, collective, and deeply connected to place and people, was Sparta's gift to the Greek imagination, and it still resonates today with anyone who has ever been asked to hold fast when the world is falling apart. This is Sparta as it lived and breathed in the centuries before the great crises that would test its strength and ultimately reveal its limitations. A city built on fertile ground, surrounded by mountains, sustained by the labor of a conquered people, governed by a constitution that mixed monarchy, aristocracy, and popular participation into a system of extraordinary complexity. A city that turned childhood into an ordeal, dinner into a discipline, and speech into a weapon. A city where women ran and wrestled while other Greek women stayed indoors, where kings ruled in pairs and answered to elected officials, where courage was a civic duty and cowardice a social death sentence. A city that worshipped its gods with the same intensity it trained its soldiers, and that understood, perhaps more clearly than any other community in the ancient world, that the line between strength and vulnerability was as thin as a bronze shield's edge. There is so much more to explore. The great battles that tested Spartan courage on the world stage, the rivalries that shaped Greek history, the slow decline that turned the mightiest military power in Greece into a shadow of its former self. The story of Sparta is not a simple tale of rise and fall. It is a study in what happens when a society commits itself entirely to a single vision of excellence, pursuing that vision with a determination that is both awe-inspiring and deeply troubling. Sparta teaches us that strength can grow from discipline, but also that discipline can become a prison. It teaches us that unity can produce extraordinary results, but also that unity achieved through exclusion carries a hidden cost that eventually comes due. And it teaches us that the most enduring legacy of any civilization is not its buildings or its armies, but the questions it forces us to ask about ourselves. The story continues, and there is much further to travel through the world of ancient Sparta. The great trials are still ahead. Thermopylae, Plataea, the long struggle with Athens, the shattering defeat at Leuctra, and the slow, painful unraveling of a system that had seemed, for so long, to be unbreakable. But for now, we have laid the foundation. We have seen the land, met the people, and begun to understand the forces that shaped them. We have glimpsed the beauty and the horror of a civilization that turned human beings into instruments of collective will, and we have begun to ask the questions that Sparta's story demands. The next chapter awaits, and with it, the battles, the heroes, the tragedies, and the lessons that have kept this ancient city alive in human memory for more than 2,000 years. There are moments in history that burn so brightly they never fully cool. Moments where the decisions of a handful of people ripple outward across centuries, changing the shape of the world in ways that nobody standing in that moment could have fully understood. The Persian Wars were exactly that kind of moment, and Sparta stood at the center of them with a steadiness that would become the stuff of legend. But to understand what Sparta did during those years of crisis, you first need to understand the world that the crisis threatened to destroy. By the early 5th century before the Common Era, Greece was a fractured, argumentative, brilliantly creative collection of independent city-states that agreed on almost nothing except the language they spoke and the gods they worshipped. Athens was building its democracy and its naval power. Corinth was growing rich on trade. Thebes was consolidating influence in the central region of Boeotia, and Sparta sat in its valley, training its citizens, watching its helots, and maintaining the most feared land army in the Greek world. These cities competed with each other, fought each other, and distrusted each other with a passion that made genuine unity seem almost impossible. Then the Persians came, and everything changed. The Persian Empire under Darius and later his son Xerxes was the largest political entity the ancient world had yet produced. It stretched from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor all the way east to the borders of India, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, cultures, and traditions under a single imperial administration. Its armies were vast, its resources seemingly inexhaustible, and its ambitions correspondingly enormous. When Persian forces crossed into Greece, they were not simply conducting a military campaign. They were extending an empire that had already swallowed civilizations far older and far larger than anything Greece could claim. The first Persian invasion, launched after Athens supported a revolt by Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor, ended in unexpected Greek triumph at Marathon in 490 before the Common Era. The Athenians, fighting largely without Spartan support due to a religious festival that delayed the Spartan army's departure, defeated a Persian force on the coastal plain northeast of Athens and sent a message that astonished the ancient world. The empire was not invincible. Greek soldiers, fighting in the tight formation of the phalanx, could match and defeat Persian forces even when outnumbered. But Marathon was a warning, not a resolution. Darius died before he could organize a proper response, and it fell to his son Xerxes to prepare a campaign so massive that it would leave no room for doubt about the outcome. Xerxes spent years assembling forces from across the empire, gathering soldiers, ships, supplies, and engineering expertise on a scale that Greece had never witnessed. Ancient sources describe numbers so enormous that modern historians treat them with healthy skepticism. But even the most conservative estimates suggest a force large enough to overwhelm any single Greek city with ease. Xerxes was not coming to punish Athens for Marathon. He was coming to end Greek independence entirely. The Greek response to this threat revealed both the fragility and the resilience of their fractured world. Some cities chose submission, calculating that resistance was suicidal and that accommodation with Persia was the only path to survival. Others chose to fight, driven by a combination of pride, stubbornness, and genuine belief that freedom was worth dying for. The coalition that formed to resist Xerxes was small, internally divided, and strategically challenged at every turn. But it had one asset that the Persians could not easily overcome: the quality of its fighting men, and above all, the quality of the Spartans who stood at the coalition's military core. Sparta's leadership of the Greek resistance was not accidental. The city's military reputation gave it an authority that no other Greek state could match. When frightened Greek communities looked for someone to organize their defense, they turned to Sparta because Sparta represented something that fear desperately needs: the image of a power that does not easily break. The Spartans accepted this role with the same combination of pride and practicality that characterized everything they did. They understood that a Persian victory would mean the end of everything they had built, and they were prepared to pay whatever price resistance demanded. The strategic situation facing the Greeks was daunting. Xerxes' army needed to move southward through the Greek mainland to reach Athens and the other major cities of central and southern Greece. The geography of Greece, with its mountains and narrow passes, offered the defenders occasional opportunities to slow this advance. But the Persian navy could potentially outflank any land position by landing troops behind the defenders. The Greeks needed to hold both land and sea simultaneously, with forces that were vastly outnumbered in both dimensions. The pass at Thermopylae offered the most promising opportunity for a land defense. The name means hot gates, a reference to the sulfurous hot springs in the area, and the physical reality of the place gave the Greeks something that raw numbers could not provide: geography that neutralized the Persian advantage in size. At its narrowest point, the pass between the sea and the cliffs was so constricted that a large army could not spread out and bring its full force to bear. Defenders who could hold that narrow ground could resist attackers regardless of how many more the attackers had waiting behind them. The Greek force that assembled at Thermopylae in 480 before the Common Era was a coalition of contingents from several city-states. Leonidas, one of Sparta's 2 kings, commanded the combined force, which included soldiers from Corinth, Arcadia, Phlius, Mycenae, Thespii, Thebes, and other communities, as well as the famous 300 Spartans who would later become the focus of the story. The total Greek force numbered several thousand men, not merely the 300 that popular memory tends to celebrate. Those other soldiers fought, endured, and died alongside the Spartans, and their contribution deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous names. Leonidas himself was a figure of considerable complexity. He was not a young man seeking glory. He was an experienced leader who had likely spent his entire adult life within the demanding structures of Spartan society, passing through the agoge, serving in the military, navigating the political complexities of dual kingship, and accumulating the kind of tested judgment that the Spartan system was designed to produce. He understood what the defense of Thermopylae meant strategically. It was a delaying action, not a battle for decisive victory. The goal was to buy time for the Greek coalition to organize, for the fleet to engage the Persian navy, and for the wider defense of Greece to take shape. The initial days of the battle went better than almost anyone had expected. The narrow pass worked exactly as the defenders had hoped. Persian troops were fed into the killing ground in waves, and the disciplined Greek phalanx, with the Spartans at its core, cut them down with horrifying efficiency. The tight formation of shields and spears was perfectly suited to this kind of fighting. There was no room for the Persian forces to use their superior numbers to surround the Greeks, no space for cavalry to operate, no opportunity for the kind of wide flanking movements that large armies depended upon. The Greeks held their ground and inflicted casualties that shocked observers on both sides. Xerxes reportedly watched the fighting from a throne positioned on a hillside above the pass, and ancient accounts suggest that he rose from his seat 3 times during the battle in anxiety at the losses his forces were suffering. Whether this detail is historically precise or a later embellishment, it captures something true about the psychological dynamic of those initial days. The most powerful empire in the world was being held at a narrow gap in the mountains by a force that should, by any reasonable calculation, have been swept aside in hours. The Spartans in particular performed with a discipline and ferocity that must have been deeply unsettling to watch. They fought not as a collection of individuals, but as a single organism, advancing and retreating in coordinated movements that turned the confined space of the pass into a mechanical grinder that consumed Persian soldiers by the hundreds. But the pass had a flaw that strategy could not overcome. There was another path through the mountains, a track that wound around the cliffs and emerged behind the Greek position. The Greeks knew about this path and had stationed a force of Phocian soldiers to guard it. When a local man named Ephialtes revealed the path's location to the Persians and offered to guide them, the strategic situation changed completely. A Persian force moved through the mountains under cover of darkness, scattered the Phocian guards, and began descending toward the rear of the Greek position. When word reached Leonidas that his position had been flanked and that the Persian force was moving around behind him, he faced a decision that has been analyzed and debated for 2,500 years. Most of the Greek contingents withdrew, either because Leonidas ordered them to or because they recognized that staying meant certain death without strategic purpose. Some forces, including the Thespians and, in the account of most ancient writers, a Theban contingent, remained. The Thespians stayed voluntarily, choosing to die beside the Spartans rather than withdraw to a city that they knew the Persians would destroy regardless. The Thebans' presence in the final stand has been disputed, with some ancient sources suggesting they surrendered rather than fought to the end. And the Spartans stayed. Leonidas kept his 300 at the pass when withdrawal was still possible. The reasons for this decision have been discussed endlessly, and the most honest answer is that we cannot know with complete certainty what was in his mind. But the context provides important clues. The Spartan code of conduct made retreat in the face of a surrounded, hopeless position deeply problematic from a cultural standpoint. Leonidas had received a prophecy from Delphi suggesting that either Sparta must fall or one of its kings must die. He had selected for this campaign 300 men who all had living sons, which ancient tradition interpreted as a sign that he did not expect the force to return. And he understood, with the strategic intelligence of an experienced commander, that a determined last stand at Thermopylae could have value beyond the immediate military outcome. A last stand that killed large numbers of Persian soldiers, that demonstrated the limits of Persian power, and that gave the Greeks a story of heroic resistance which strengthened the coalition's will to continue fighting. Fear was already working on the Greek alliance, and defections were a real concern. A sacrifice that produced a legend could be worth more than a cautious withdrawal that produced survival. Leonidas may have calculated that his death, and the deaths of his 300, could purchase something that his survival could not: the transformation of a military setback into a moral victory. The final battle was brutal and intimate. With Persian forces pressing from the front, and the flanking force descending from behind. The remaining Greeks gathered on a small hill and fought until their spears broke, their swords broke, and finally they fought with their hands and their teeth. The Persians, who had been ordered by Xerxes to take Leonidas alive if possible, killed him in the fighting, and the struggle over his body was fierce. The Greeks held it initially, but were eventually overwhelmed. When it was over, the Persian army moved through Thermopylae and continued south toward Athens. Greece did not fall. The naval battle at Salamis, fought shortly after Thermopylae, ended in a decisive Greek victory that destroyed the Persian fleet and made Xerxes' position untenable. Without naval support to keep his enormous army supplied, the great king was forced to withdraw with a large portion of his forces. The Persian threat was not over, but its momentum was broken, and the following year would bring the decisive land engagement that finally ended the invasion. The Battle of Plataea in 479 before the Common Era was the moment when Spartan military excellence proved its value in a context broader than a doomed last stand. The Persian army that remained in Greece under the command of Mardonius was a formidable force, well-equipped and experienced, but now fighting far from its supply lines and in terrain that suited Greek fighting methods. The Greek coalition that assembled to meet it was also formidable, a large force of allied hoplites with Sparta providing the military core and the overall command structure. The Spartan commander at Plataea was Pausanias, the regent acting for Leonidas's young son. He was a man whose talents would later be overshadowed by personal scandal and political disgrace, but at Plataea, he demonstrated a quality of military leadership that proved decisive. The battle was complex and dangerous, involving days of maneuvering, supply difficulties, failed attacks, and moments of genuine crisis before the final clash that decided the outcome. The critical moment came when Mardonius, tired of watching the Greeks evade direct engagement, launched a cavalry assault that disrupted Greek supply lines and forced a difficult redeployment. The Greek forces began moving to a new position during the night, but the movement became disorganized, with different contingents failing to coordinate properly. Dawn found the Spartan and Tegean forces exposed and separated from their allies, and Mardonius seized the opportunity to attack with his full force. What followed demonstrated exactly why Sparta's training system produced soldiers unlike anything else in the Greek world. The Spartans were attacked before their position was fully established, with allied support not yet in place, and facing a Persian force that had the advantages of surprise and initiative. In that moment, everything the Agoge had built was put to its ultimate test. These were men who had spent their entire lives being conditioned to hold position under pressure, to resist panic when chaos surrounded them, and to trust the man beside them when nothing else was certain. They held. The Spartan phalanx absorbed the Persian assault with a steadiness that ancient sources describe in terms close to awe. Mardonius, fighting from horseback at the front of his forces, was killed in the fighting, an act that broke the cohesion of the Persian command. As the battle turned, the Persian forces began to dissolve, and what had been a dangerous moment for the Greeks became a catastrophic rout for their enemies. Thousands of Persian soldiers died in the aftermath. The camps and supplies of the Persian army were captured, and with them, a wealth of precious objects that revealed the extraordinary resources of the empire that had just been defeated. Plataea was not a defensive last stand. It was a decisive military victory achieved through tactical intelligence, the steadiness of trained soldiers under extreme pressure, and the willingness of Spartan leadership to maintain discipline when circumstances were most dangerous. The battle ended the Persian invasion of the Greek mainland and secured the independence of the city-states that had chosen to resist. It was one of the most consequential battles in ancient history, and Sparta's role in it was central. The victory at Plataea gave Sparta something it had always claimed, but now possessed in undeniable form: the status of protector of Greece. Other cities had contributed to the victory, and their contributions mattered, but the Spartan name, already burnished by Thermopylae, now carried the additional weight of decisive success. The city that had sent 300 men to die in a mountain pass had also led the alliance that destroyed the Persian army in the field and saved Greek civilization from incorporation into the empire's vast machinery. This prestige was real, and Sparta used it carefully in the decades that followed. But prestige is not permanent. and the world that existed after the Persian Wars was already beginning to shift in ways that would challenge Sparta's preeminence. The most significant shift was the rise of Athens, which had played a critical role in the naval victory at Salamis and emerged from the Persian Wars with a confidence, an ambition, and a democratic energy that would eventually bring the two great powers of Greece into direct and devastating conflict. Athens and Sparta were different in almost every conceivable way. Athens was a maritime power, its wealth built on trade, its navy the largest in the Greek world, its political system a democracy that gave ordinary citizens a direct voice in governance. It was a city of merchants, philosophers, playwrights, sculptors, and architects, a place that celebrated intellectual and artistic achievement alongside military valor. Its public buildings were among the most beautiful in the ancient world. Its cultural output was extraordinary. Its democratic institutions, however imperfect by modern standards, represented a genuine attempt to govern through broad participation. Sparta was the opposite in almost every dimension. It distrusted trade, discouraged arts for their own sake, ran an oligarchic system that restricted political power to a small elite, and valued silence, endurance, and military discipline above the kind of intellectual and cultural ferment that Athens produced. The two cities had cooperated under the pressure of Persian invasion, but that cooperation always existed within a framework of mutual suspicion. They represented genuinely different visions of what a Greek city should be, and as both grew more powerful in the decades after the Persian Wars, the competition between those visions became impossible to contain. The conflict that eventually erupted between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 before the Common Era, was one of the longest, most destructive, and most historically significant wars in the ancient world. It reshaped the Greek world completely, exhausted the resources of both combatants, and created conditions that would eventually make both vulnerable to powers rising beyond the Greek peninsula. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the conflict and wrote about it with an analytical precision that still astonishes readers today, identified the underlying cause with characteristic directness. Sparta feared the growth of Athenian power, and that fear made war inevitable. Sparta's fear was not irrational. Athens had spent the decades after the Persian Wars building an empire. What began as a defensive alliance of Greek states, the Delian League, organized to continue resistance against Persia, gradually transformed under Athenian leadership into something much closer to an Athenian tributary system. Member states that had originally joined as equals found themselves paying tribute to Athens, hosting Athenian garrisons, and submitting their legal disputes to Athenian courts. The treasury of the alliance was moved from Delos to Athens, and its funds were used, among other things, to build the Parthenon, the magnificent temple that still dominates the Athenian Acropolis and stands as one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. From an Athenian perspective, this development was entirely reasonable. Athens was bearing the greatest military burden of the alliance, providing the ships and the naval expertise that kept Persia at bay, and it deserved compensation for that service. From the perspective of other Greek states, it looked disturbingly like the replacement of Persian domination with Athenian domination. And from Sparta's perspective, it looked like the construction of a rival power center that might eventually threaten Laconian dominance in the Greek world. The war that followed was unlike anything Greece had experienced before. Previous conflicts had been relatively brief affairs, decided by a season or two of campaigning and the outcome of a few major battles. The Peloponnesian War was different in character, scale, and duration. It was a long, grinding conflict in which the fundamental asymmetry between the two powers, Sparta's land strength against Athens' naval strength, prevented either side from delivering a knockout blow against the other's core. Sparta's strategy in the early years of the war was to invade Attica, the territory surrounding Athens, and devastate the crops and farmland that supported the Athenian population. This approach reflected Spartan military strength and Spartan military thinking: march in, destroy, demonstrate dominance, and force the enemy to fight on Spartan terms. The problem was that the Athenian leader Pericles refused to cooperate with this strategy. He pulled the Athenian population inside the city walls, allowed the Spartans to burn the countryside, and relied on naval power to strike at Spartan interests around the coast of the Peloponnese. Athens could be supplied by sea, and as long as its navy controlled the water, the Spartan invasions of Attica were painful but not decisive. Then the plague came. In 430 before the Common Era, a devastating epidemic struck the crowded population of Athens, killing perhaps a quarter or more of the city's inhabitants, including Pericles himself. The plague was one of the most catastrophic events in Athenian history, and it permanently weakened the city's ability to sustain the war effort it had planned. Thucydides describes the disease and its effects with clinical precision, having survived it himself, and his account remains one of the most powerful descriptions of epidemic disease in ancient literature. The physical suffering, the social dissolution, the breakdown of religious and moral conventions as people concluded that death was coming regardless of how virtuously they lived. Sparta escaped the plague, but the war continued without a clear resolution. Years passed. Campaigns were fought. Alliances shifted. Athens launched an ambitious expedition against Sicily that ended in complete catastrophe, losing thousands of soldiers and hundreds of ships in a disaster that fundamentally changed the military balance of the war. The Sicilian expedition, conceived as a bold stroke that would extend Athenian power into the western Mediterranean and provide resources for continued resistance at home, instead destroyed the naval and military strength that Athens needed to maintain its position in Greece. After Sicily, Sparta adapted its strategy in ways that reveal a flexibility not always associated with the city's image of rigid tradition. The key development was the involvement of Persia, which offered financial support to Sparta in exchange for Spartan acknowledgement of Persian claims over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. This was a morally uncomfortable arrangement for a city that had fought to defend Greek freedom from Persian domination, but Sparta's leadership proved pragmatic enough to accept uncomfortable arrangements when they offered strategic advantage. Persian money could build ships, and ships could challenge the Athenian naval power that had kept the war from a decisive conclusion. The Spartan commander Lysander was the architect of the naval strategy that finally broke Athens. He understood that the key to ending the war was not another land campaign, but the destruction of the Athenian fleet. Without naval power, Athens could not protect the grain routes from the Black Sea that fed its population, could not maintain the tribute relationships with its empire that funded its military effort, and could not project force across the Aegean. Lysander worked to build Spartan naval capability, cultivated relationships with Persian authorities who controlled the financial support, and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came at Aegospotami, a stretch of shoreline on the Hellespont where the Athenian fleet had anchored. Lysander observed that the Athenian crews were becoming careless, going ashore in large numbers to forage for food, leaving their ships partially unmanned. He struck while the fleet was vulnerable, capturing or destroying the Athenian ships before adequate resistance could be organized. The losses were catastrophic. Thousands of Athenian sailors were captured. Many were executed. The fleet that had made Athens great was gone, and without it, the city had no way to feed or defend itself. Athens surrendered in 404 before the Common Era. The walls that had protected the city for generations were torn down. The Athenian Empire was dissolved. Sparta stood at the summit of the Greek world, more powerful than it had ever been, the unchallenged military master of a civilization that stretched from the shores of Italy to the coast of Asia Minor. It was a triumph that earlier generations of Spartans could barely have imagined. And yet, within that triumph, the seeds of future disaster were already planted. Sparta had won a war, but it had not gained the wisdom to manage the peace. The city that had excelled at producing warriors and maintaining internal discipline now faced the entirely different challenge of governing a network of defeated and resentful states, managing relationships with Persian sponsors whose interests did not always align with Spartan ones, and projecting authority across distances that tested every limitation of the Spartan system. The contradictions became visible almost immediately. Sparta installed oligarchic governments in cities that had previously been democratic, often backed by Spartan garrisons, and Spartan-appointed local rulers called harmasts. These arrangements were deeply unpopular with the populations subjected to them, and the resentment they generated was intense. The city that had claimed to be liberating Greece from Athenian imperialism now looked, to many Greeks, like an imperial power wearing a different name. The hypocrisy was obvious, and obvious hypocrisy generates contempt. Spartan commanders operating abroad also discovered freedoms that the rigid social structure at home had never permitted, and some of them responded to those freedoms in ways that damaged Sparta's reputation severely. Lysander himself became enormously powerful through his foreign connections and personal ambition, accumulating influence that made even other Spartans uncomfortable. The city that had built its entire identity around the suppression of individual excess found itself producing commanders who, once removed from the social surveillance of Spartan life, pursued personal glory and private advantage with alarming enthusiasm. The tension between Sparta's domestic values and its imperial behavior created political instability at home as well. Money, that traditional enemy of Spartan discipline, began flowing into the city from tribute and the spoils of victory, and money had a way of corroding the social arrangements that Sparta's founders had supposedly designed to keep it out. Wealth accumulated in some hands. Equality, already more myth than reality in certain respects, became harder to maintain even as a rhetorical ideal. The citizen body that had held together through shared poverty and shared discipline began to feel the strain of shared prosperity. And through all of this, the helots waited. The Messenian population, bound to the land for generations, remembered what freedom had looked like before conquest, and they watched the difficulties of the state that controlled them with the patient attention of people who have learned to notice when authority is under stress. The fear that had shaped every aspect of Spartan life since the conquest of Messenia had not diminished with military victory over Athens. It had simply been postponed, pushed back by the pressure of more immediate concerns, waiting for the moment when Spartan weakness would give it room to breathe. That moment was approaching, though Sparta could not yet see it clearly. The city stood at its greatest extent of power, commanding the Greek world with an authority that no city had previously achieved. Its red cloaks, its long-haired warriors, its laconic sayings, and its fearsome reputation were known from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. The legend was at its peak, and the distance between legend and reality was growing with every year that passed. For what Sparta was discovering, with increasing discomfort, was something that every great military power eventually learns, that winning a war and building a sustainable peace require entirely different sets of skills, and that the qualities that make a city unmatched in battle can make it dangerously unsuited for the challenges of dominance. The Agoge produced men of extraordinary physical and emotional toughness, men who could hold a battle line when ordinary soldiers would have broken. But it did not produce flexible administrators, patient diplomats, or creative political thinkers capable of managing the complex, shifting landscape of post-war Greek politics. Sparta had been designed for a world of clear enemies and clear battles. The world it had inherited by defeating Athens was a world of ambiguous loyalties, complicated interests, and the endless grinding work of maintaining authority over people who resented it. The city was now being asked to do something that its entire social system had been built to prevent, to change, to adapt, to become something different from what it had always been. And Sparta, more than almost any other civilization in human history, was constitutionally incapable of responding to that demand. The walls that Sparta had never built were not protecting it now. The citizen body that was supposed to be its greatest defense was shrinking year by year, depleted by war, by the impossible social requirements of full citizenship, and by the long, slow economic pressures that had been building for generations. The system that had made Sparta great was beginning, quietly and almost invisibly, to eat itself from within. But these failures and this unraveling are a story for the next passage of our journey. For now, it is enough to hold in mind the full arc of what Sparta achieved in the years of its greatest strength, the discipline forged in childhood that produced men capable of standing at Thermopylae, the military intelligence that won Plataea, the strategic adaptation that eventually brought Athens to its knees, and the profound, irreplaceable contribution that this strange, severe, magnificent city made to the survival of the Greek world in its hour of greatest danger. When the Persians came, Sparta stood. When Greece needed leadership, Sparta led. When the battle line had to hold, Spartan shields did not waver. These are not myths. They are historical facts, as real as the soil of the Eurotas Valley, as solid as the bronze of the shields that carried them into being. And they deserve to be remembered with the full complexity they contain. not as simple heroism stripped of moral ambiguity, but as human achievement rising from a human system with all the contradictions, costs, and shadows that every human system must carry. The story of Sparta is not finished yet. The greatest trials are still ahead. Every great power carries within itself the mechanisms of its own undoing. The same qualities that drive a civilization to its peak can become, under changed circumstances, the very forces that pull it apart. Sparta is perhaps the clearest example of this truth that ancient history offers us. The city did not fall to a single catastrophic blow from an overwhelming enemy. It declined through a long, painful process in which its greatest strengths gradually became its most dangerous weaknesses, and the world around it changed faster than a society built on unchanging tradition could follow. The battle that shattered Sparta's military reputation came in 371 before the Common Era, at a place in Boeotia called Leuctra. It was not, on paper, the kind of engagement that should have destroyed a legend. Sparta had faced dangerous enemies before and survived. But Leuctra was different, because the enemy it faced had done something that previous opponents had rarely managed. They had studied Spartan tactics with enough intelligence and creativity to find the weakness hidden inside the strength. The Theban commander Epaminondas was one of the most original military minds the ancient world produced. He understood that Spartan phalanx tactics depended on a predictable arrangement, strongest troops on the right, formations of roughly equal depth across the line, engagements that rewarded discipline and endurance over tactical creativity. He decided to refuse that arrangement entirely. Instead of meeting the Spartans on their own terms, he concentrated his best troops on the left wing in a formation of extraordinary depth, 50 shields deep rather than the conventional 8 or 12. This massed column, driven forward with overwhelming force against the Spartan position, would strike before the rest of the line engaged, breaking the enemy's strongest point before the battle could settle into the grinding contest that Sparta always won. The sacred band of Thebes anchored this assault, an elite unit of 300 warriors, paired fighters whose bond with one another was considered the deepest possible human connection, who trained together with an intensity that matched anything Sparta produced. They struck the Spartan right with a force that the defenders, even with all their training and discipline, could not absorb. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting. Spartan citizens died in significant numbers. Ancient sources suggest around 400 full Spartan warriors fell at Leuctra, in a period when the entire citizen body may have numbered fewer than 2,000. The psychological damage spread far beyond the battlefield. What made Leuctra so devastating was not merely the casualties. It was the proof. For generations, the Greek world had operated under an assumption so deeply held that it barely needed stating. Spartan soldiers did not lose in open battle. That assumption had shaped diplomacy, deterred enemies, and preserved Spartan dominance more effectively than any wall or garrison could have. When Epaminondas shattered it at Leuctra, he did not just defeat an army. He destroyed a belief, and beliefs, once destroyed, cannot simply be rebuilt by winning the next engagement. The liberation of Messenia followed, and this was the wound that could not heal. Epaminondas led Theban forces into the Peloponnese itself, something that had seemed almost unthinkable before Leuctra, and he did something that struck at the very foundation of everything Sparta had built. He freed the Helots of Messenia and established a fortified city, Messene, to serve as their capital and their protection against any future attempt at reconquest. The walls of Messene were built thick and high, with a determination to make Spartan recovery of its lost territory as difficult as possible. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without Messenia, Sparta lost the agricultural base that had sustained its citizen class for centuries. The land that Helot labor had worked, that had fed Spartan households and funded contributions to the Syssitia, that had given citizen men the freedom to train and serve without worrying about their own survival. All of that was gone. The system that Lycurgus supposedly designed, or that had evolved over generations into its classical form, depended on that agricultural wealth the way a building depends on its foundation. Remove the foundation, and the structure above it does not collapse immediately, but it begins to lean, to crack, to settle in ways that make every subsequent stress more dangerous. The citizen body continued its long decline. The number of full Spartan citizens, already shrinking through decades of war and the impossible demands of maintaining status, fell further and further below the level needed to sustain the military and political functions of the state. This was not a problem that could be solved by training harder or fighting more bravely. It was a structural failure built into the system itself. Citizenship required land, and land required helot labor, and helot labor required the conquest of Messenia, and Messenia was gone. The chain of dependency that had made Sparta function had been cut at a critical link, and no amount of discipline or reputation could reforge it. Sparta made attempts to address its declining numbers. There were experiments with granting citizenship to people who had previously been excluded, with recruiting non-citizens into military roles, with adjusting the social requirements that had always defined full membership in the community of equals. But these adjustments were incomplete, reluctant, and always constrained by the deep Spartan suspicion of change. A society that had built its entire identity around the unchanging nature of its institutions found it almost impossible to reform those institutions decisively enough to address a crisis that required exactly that kind of decisive action. The world beyond Sparta's borders continued to shift. Thebes dominated Greek affairs for a period after Leuctra, until Epaminondas himself was killed at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 before the Common Era, a battle in which Theban forces won the field but lost their irreplaceable commander, and with him, the strategic vision that had made Theban dominance possible. After Epaminondas fell, the brief Theban hegemony collapsed, and Greece returned to the fragmented competition between city-states that had characterized the period before the Persian Wars. But this fragmentation no longer served Sparta as it once might have. The city that had previously used the divisions among its neighbors to maintain its own position of unchallenged military authority now found that it was simply one player among many in a complicated game, no longer possessed of the decisive military advantage that had once settled arguments before they began. Other cities had learned from Leuctra. Other commanders had studied Theban innovations and developed their own tactical approaches. The military landscape of Greece had evolved, and Sparta, with its rigid attachment to traditional methods, had not evolved with it. To the north, an even more transformative power was rising. Macedonia under Philip II was developing military capabilities that would eventually make all the debates among Greek city-states seem almost irrelevant. Philip combined the Macedonian cavalry tradition with adapted versions of Greek infantry tactics, creating a combined arms force of extraordinary flexibility and power. His son Alexander would take that force and conquer most of the known world. But long before Alexander's campaigns began, Philip had already demonstrated that the era of Greek city-state dominance was ending, replaced by a new kind of military and political power that operated on an entirely different scale. Sparta retreated inward as the Macedonian star rose. It refused to join Alexander's campaigns. It attempted a revolt against Macedonian authority that ended in failure and further military losses. It became, increasingly, a regional power of diminishing significance, still proud, still attached to its traditions, still capable of producing soldiers of considerable quality, but no longer the force that had once made the entire Greek world hold its breath. Yet something remarkable happened in this long decline. Sparta's legend did not decline with its power. In fact, as the city became less militarily relevant, its reputation in certain respects became more powerful than ever. Writers, philosophers, and political thinkers across the Greek world and later the Roman world returned again and again to Sparta as a subject of fascination, debate, and moral instruction. What had Sparta achieved? What had it sacrificed to achieve it? Was its discipline admirable or horrifying? Was its equality genuine or illusory? Was its decline inevitable given its system, or could different choices have preserved its greatness? These questions never produced agreed answers, which is precisely why they kept being asked. The philosopher Plato, writing his ideal republic, borrowed elements from Spartan practice while also criticizing aspects of it. Aristotle analyzed the Spartan constitution with the cold precision of a political scientist and found both admirable features and fundamental flaws. Later writers created collections of Spartan sayings and customs that preserved the image of the laconic warrior for audiences who lived centuries after Sparta's military glory had faded. The Roman world looked to Sparta as a model of ancient virtue. A contrast with what Roman moralists feared was the softness and luxury of their own time. This literary afterlife reveals something important about how Sparta actually survived. It survived as an idea. The physical city persisted in the Eurotas Valley. Its walls eventually built. Its festivals continued. Its rituals performed for visitors who came to see what they believed were living remnants of ancient practice. But the Sparta that gripped the imagination of the ancient world and has continued to grip the imagination of every subsequent generation was not primarily the physical place. It was a set of values, a style of life, a particular answer to the question of what human beings owe to their community and to each other. That idea has proven extraordinarily durable, in ways both inspiring and troubling. Throughout history, political movements and military cultures have reached back to Sparta for models and inspiration. Some of what they found there was genuinely worth preserving. The emphasis on collective responsibility, the rejection of luxury as a civic value, the insistence that courage is not a gift but a discipline that must be cultivated through practice and hardship. These are ideas that retain real power regardless of their original context. But other elements of the Spartan legacy are far more troubling, and they deserve to be remembered with equal clarity. The Spartan system depended on the subjugation of a population that outnumbered its masters many times over. Its famous equality was built on someone else's permanent inequality. Its celebrated courage was possible because other people's fear kept the agricultural machinery running. When later admirers reached for the Spartan model, they sometimes took the inspiring surface and ignored the brutal foundation, producing a romanticism that served dangerous purposes. The ruins of ancient Sparta, modest and quiet in their valley beneath the great ridge of Taygetus, have their own lesson to offer anyone willing to hear it. Here was a city whose name echoed across the ancient world, whose warriors were feared from Persia to Sicily, whose social system was debated by the greatest minds Greece produced. And what remains? Fragments of walls, traces of sanctuaries, a landscape that asks the visitor to use imagination rather than simply absorbing spectacle. The absence of grand ruins is itself a kind of statement. Sparta's most enduring monument was never made of stone. It was made of memory, of story, of the questions it forces us to ask about power, freedom, justice, and the price of collective excellence. Those questions have never stopped being asked, and they never will. Every generation finds in Sparta a mirror that reflects its own anxieties and aspirations. We see in it what we fear about ourselves, the capacity for discipline to become cruelty, for unity to require exclusion, for strength to rest on foundations we would rather not examine. We also see what we admire, the possibility of genuine courage, of commitment to something larger than personal comfort, of a community bound together by shared standards rather than divided by private interests. Sparta does not offer us simple lessons. It never did. It was a real place, inhabited by real people who faced real dangers and made real choices. Many of those choices admirable and many of them deeply wrong. The Helots who worked its fields deserved their freedom, and the liberation of Messenia was justice as much as strategy. The warriors who stood at Thermopylae demonstrated something genuinely extraordinary about human capacity for courage under impossible pressure. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is exactly what makes Sparta so impossible to set aside. The ancient city is quiet now. The Eurotas still moves through its valley. The peaks of Taygetus still rise above the plain, as dramatic and indifferent as they were when Spartan boys looked up at them from their rough beds on cold mornings, learning to find strength in a landscape that offered beauty without comfort. The hot springs still flow at the place the Greeks called the Hot Gates, where 300 men and their allies held a narrow pass against an empire and gave the world a story it has been retelling ever since. What Sparta ultimately leaves us with is not a blueprint to follow or a warning to avoid, but something more valuable than either. A genuine encounter with the full complexity of human civilization, with all its capacity for both greatness and cruelty, all its ability to pursue noble ideals through terrible means, and all its power to generate, even in decline and ruin, a legacy that outlasts everything else it built. Sparta's walls crumbled. Its citizen body vanished. Its military dominance was broken on a Boeotian battlefield by a commander who refused to fight on its terms. But the story endures. And as long as human beings ask questions about courage, community, freedom, and the price of belonging, Sparta will endure with it. Not as a myth, not as a symbol stripped of its contradictions, but as a real place where real people tried, with extraordinary intensity. The world we think we know is built upon layers of forgotten civilizations, buried ambitions, and choices made by people whose names have been swallowed by time. But every now and then,